For 24 years, the United States Army operated a classified field unit in the Alaskan interior whose official purpose was environmental survey and cold weather wildlife documentation. That was the cover. The actual the one written in a series of numbered operational reports that were classified at the compartmented level and never declassified, was the systematic observation, documentation, and if possible, the biological sampling of a hominid species that the Army had first encountered during Arctic survival training exercises in the winter of 1971. I was the third person assigned to that unit. I was part of it for 19 of its 24 years, and I am the last living member of the original roster. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've ever had an encounter like this. My name is Glenn Hartley. I am 76 years old. I spent 31 years in the United States Army, most of that time attached to intelligence functions that I am still only partially at liberty to describe. I was born in Macon, Georgia in 1948, the son of a machinist and a school teacher, and I joined the Army in 1968 because the draft was coming for me regardless, and I figured I would rather walk in standing up than be dragged in. I did one tour in Vietnam. I drank Valley and Environs infantry, and I came out of that with a Purple Heart, a hearing loss in my left ear that has never fully resolved, and a particular kind of calm about difficult situations that only comes from having been through the worst version of them already. In the fall of 1970, I was reassigned to Fort Wainwright outside Fairbanks, Alaska, as part of an intelligence support detachment. The Army did not tell me much about why they needed me there. They told me to report, and I reported. That was the culture. What I need you to understand about Fort Wainwright in the early 70s is that the base sat at the edge of one of the largest undisturbed wilderness regions on the planet. Fairbanks proper was a small city, maybe 30,000 people, with a university and a handful of bars and a freight economy built on the pipeline that was still 3 years from breaking ground. But everything north and east and south of that cluster of buildings was simply space. Hundreds of thousands of square miles of white spruce forest, permafrost bogs, river drainages that ran for 200 miles without touching a road. The Tanana River ran along the south side of the base, broad and silty and moving fast even in January. The Alaska Range sat to the south, white peaks stacked against the sky so high that on clear days you could see Denali from the parking lot of the PX, this enormous white triangle hanging above everything else, and to the north, the White Mountains, then the Yukon River country, then the Brooks Range, all of it enormous, all of it empty, as people who have never been to the subarctic tend to think of it as emptiness, because anyone who has spent real time in that country knows it is full of life operating on terms that have nothing to do with human comfort or human scale. I had been at Fort Wainwright for about 8 months when a lieutenant colonel named Dale Spruill called me into a conference room in a building that was not on any base map I had been issued. The building was designated only by a number, and it sat behind a second perimeter fence on the eastern side of the installation. There were 3 other people in that conference room. A captain named Roy Elkins, who I would later learn had a background in anthropology before the Army got hold of him, a civilian contractor named Earl Cooper, who worked for a company out of Anchorage that I was told did environmental consulting for the Department of Defense, and a Tanana Athabascan woman named Connie Phillips, who was employed as a cultural liaison and translator. Spruill did not ease into it. He laid a folder on the table and opened it to a series of photographs, and he said, in a flat, matter-of-fact voice that I came to associate with people who had been living with unusual information long enough to lose their sense of its weight, that the Army had a problem it had not anticipated when it began conducting winter survival exercises in the upper Tanana drainage. The photographs showed footprints. They were taken in snow with a boot placed alongside for scale, and the footprints were roughly 22 inches in length, deeply impressed, clearly bipedal, with a stride length that the boot, a standard issue size 11, could not begin to approximate. The prints were spaced at intervals suggesting a gait of somewhere between 6 and 8 feet per step. Whatever had made them was moving fast, and it was heavy because the impressions were punched nearly 8 inches into a hard-packed snowpack that a man my size at 180 pounds in full winter gear barely dented. Spruill told me that the prints had first been found in February of 1971 by a 4-man survival exercise team operating in the drainage south of the White Mountains, about 60 miles northeast of Fairbanks. The team had reported them through the Standard Channel, which was the base wildlife officer, because the assumption was a bear. Except that bears in interior Alaska are in full hibernation in February. No bear was going to be moving across an open snowfield at minus 38 degrees. The wildlife officer had forwarded the report upward with a notation to that effect, and it had landed on Sproul's desk with a cover sheet that read, "In the clinical shorthand of military bureaucracy, anomalous biological activity, non-attributable." The team had also reported a second detail. They had heard sounds, not on the night they found the prints, but the previous night, from a stand of white spruce on the eastern edge of their campsite. Low-frequency vocalizations, continuous, in sequences that one of the team members, a sergeant named Ray Henderson, had described in his incident report as sounding like a man trying to communicate from very far away, except the sound was coming from directly upwind and moving. Henderson's report used the word patterned. The sounds had a pattern to them, a rhythm, like someone was cycling through a set of phrases with variations he could almost organize. I looked at the photographs. I looked at Connie Phillips. I asked her if the Athabascan people of this region had traditional knowledge about what might leave prints like that in the snow. She looked at me with the careful patience of a woman who has answered a version of this question many times and understood that the person asking it was not yet ready for the full answer, and she said simply that yes, the Tanana Athabascans had oral traditions going back many generations about what they called in the Tanana dialect a phrase that translates roughly as the one who walks the ridges. She said this was not a figure from mythology, not a spirit or a supernatural being. It was treated in the traditional knowledge as a living species, a neighbor, one that kept mostly to the deep places, but that had been seen many times over many centuries by people who knew how to be in the forest quietly enough to see it.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. And let's get you back to the video.
I asked Sproul what exactly he wanted from me. He wanted a small team, 4 to 6 people, with an intelligence background capable of operating in extreme cold, disciplined enough to observe and document without engaging or alarming, and trusted enough to keep their mouths shut about everything they found. The team's official designation would be the Environmental Biological Survey Section, attached to the base's Natural Resources Office for cover purposes. The actual reporting chain went through him directly to a numbered file at the Army Intelligence Command Headquarters in Fort Meade, Maryland. There were exactly 7 people in the entire Army who knew what the unit was actually doing, and that number was about to become 10. I said yes. Not because I fully understood what I was agreeing to, but because I had come out of Vietnam with a particular appetite for situations that existed outside the normal boundaries of what was supposed to be happening. And whatever Sprolo was describing was clearly that, and because the photographs were real. I knew what a fabricated field report looked like. I had seen enough of them in intelligence work, and these were not fabricated. The prints in the snow were exactly what they appeared to be, and they did not belong to anything I had been trained to identify. We began formal operations in March of 1972. The unit, which we called the Section among ourselves, never had an official name beyond its environmental survey designation. Our cover story was that we were conducting baseline studies of wildlife populations in preparation for the environmental impact assessments that would be required for the Trans-Alaska pipeline construction. This was perfect cover for 3 reasons. First, the pipeline was genuinely being planned and genuinely did require environmental surveys. Second, environmental survey teams in that era could justify being almost anywhere in the interior without raising questions. Third, the work required long periods in remote locations, frequently alone or in small groups, which exactly suited what we actually needed to do. Our primary operating area in those first years was the Tanana Flats in the lower White Mountains drainage, the same region where the initial contact had been made. The Tanana Flats is a broad alluvial plain south of the White Mountains, cut through by the Tanana River and its tributaries, covered in a mosaic of black spruce forest, open tundra, and the shallow lakes and bogs that form everywhere. The permafrost sits close to the surface and water cannot drain. In summer, it is impossibly wet. The mosquitoes so thick, you breathe them in if you open your mouth. The ground, spongy and unpredictable underfoot, a patchwork of tussock grass and waterlogged moss that can swallow a boot to the knee without warning. In winter, it is the cleanest silence I have ever experienced. Temperatures that drop below -50 before wind chill. Birch trees so cold that the wood contracts with sounds like rifle shots in the night. The aurora overhead some evenings, green and white curtains moving with a slow deliberation that makes everything below them look small and temporary. Roy Elkins was our field lead. He was 34 years old in 1972, compact and wiry as men who stay thin because they are always in motion, with a background in physical anthropology that Sproul had recruited him specifically to bring. Elkins had written his thesis at Indiana University on bipedal locomotion patterns in living and fossil hominids, which I did not fully understand the significance of until I watched him spend 45 minutes on his hands and knees in a snowfield, measuring the angle of toe splay in a print left overnight while the temperature had been -41. He was methodical in a way that bordered on obsessive, and he treated every piece of physical evidence with the reverence of someone who understood exactly how important it was and how completely unprepared the world outside our unit was to receive it. Earl Cooper was our logistics man. He was older, 50 or so, when I met him, with a face like tanned leather and hands that had spent decades in the bush. He had grown up in Bush, Alaska, he told me once, the son of a trapper who had run lines in the country west of the Yukon. He knew the terrain as thoroughly as other men know their own neighborhoods, the specific ice formations that indicate a spring beneath the surface, the moose trails that stayed packed through the deepest snow, the places where the wind funnels down out of the mountains with enough force to displace a wall tent if you staked it wrong. He also spoke enough Athabascan to make himself understood in the villages along the Tanana, which mattered because our real intelligence in those early years came from the villages, from the families who had been living alongside what they called the one who walks the ridges for longer than any written record. Connie Phillips was the link to that knowledge. She was from Tanacross, a small Athabascan village about 180 miles southeast of Fairbanks on the Tanana River, and she had come to the unit through Sproul's contacts in the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Juneau. She was direct in a way that cut through military deference without being confrontational about it, and she made it clear from the first week that the traditional knowledge she was bringing to us was not ours to own or publish or use for institutional purposes. It was shared on her terms because her community had decided that having the Army know the truth was better than having the Army blunder around in the deep timber shooting at things it didn't understand. She had seen a photograph of the prints Sproul showed me. She had looked at them and said quietly that it had been a long time since anyone from outside the community was willing to listen. She took me out to the village of Minto in May of that first year, down the road that branches off the Elliott Highway and runs southwest through the lowland spruce to the community on Minto Flats. Minto sits on the Tolovana River in a broad expanse of wetland that is its own world in every season. She introduced me to an elder named Thomas who was in his 70s and who had spent his entire life reading the country around him with a precision that no instrumentation I carried could match. Thomas spoke through Connie, and he told me things that I wrote down in a notebook I kept separate from my official reports. He said the one who walks the ridges had been known to the Tanana people since before the time anyone could remember. He told us they were not spirits and not men, but they were closer to men than to any other living thing. They were shy, he explained, as very large things that have been hunted become shy, not from fear exactly, but from calculation. They learned quickly what posed a threat and what did not, and they adjusted their movement accordingly. They were most commonly seen, he told us, in the shoulder seasons, the transitions of April and October when the country was changing and the food that continuous them was either emerging or receding, and they had to move to follow it. In the old times, he continued, before the military came to the interior and before the pipeline survey crews started running helicopters over the drainage, encounters were more frequent. Not common, but not exceptional either. His grandfather had described, he told us, building a food cache on the upper Tanana once and returning to find that someone had taken the dried meat from the lowest rack but had left the contents of the higher ones untouched, and that the rack itself, a pole structure raised on 4 posts, had been approached from a direction that the snow showed as single footprints, not the snowshoe trails of any person he knew. One more thing came, and I wrote it down word for word as Connie translated it. He said, "These people do not come to us. We go into their country, and if we are respectful in how we go, they let us pass. If we are not, they do not harm us. They simply leave, and then we are alone in a place that is very far from home with no one watching over us." Their absence, once they withdrew from a place they had been watching over, had the specific quality of abandonment. As if a protection had been lifted, the elders believed, he told us, that the presence of the one who walks the ridges in a hunting area was a sign of health in that country, and that when hunters returned from a camp and said they had felt watched, the elders considered this good news rather than alarming. He did not say any of this with drama. He said it with the flatness of someone describing a familiar species, the same tone you use talking about a neighbor you have known your whole life. I drove back to Fairbanks that evening on the Elliott Highway with the windows cracked despite the cold and Thomas's words running through my head. The military intelligence part of my brain was organizing the information into operational categories: behavioral patterns, habitat use, social structure, sensory capabilities, response to human presence. The other part of my brain, the part that was still a 24-year-old from Macon, Georgia, was sitting in a silence that had no category for itself. I had just been told by a man who had no reason to lie and every reason to guard his community's knowledge carefully that there was a species living in the forests of the Alaskan interior that no scientific institution in the country acknowledged, that the Army had sent me specifically to document, and that had been known for generations to the people who shared its territory. The forest outside my truck window looked different on the drive back, not threatening, just full. Full in a way I had not perceived before and could not unperceive afterward. The section spent the summer of 1972 in observation mode. We set up a base camp on a bench of ground above the Salcha River about 40 miles southeast of Fairbanks in the Tanana drainage, using the environmental survey cover to justify our presence in an area that saw almost no other human traffic except the occasional subsistence hunter from Salcha village. The bench gave us a clear line of sight to a broad river bar below and the spruce forest on the opposite bank, and we ran trail cameras, or what passed for trail cameras in 1972, which was a Nikon F2, mounted on a tripod with a pressure-sensitive trigger wire strung across a game trail in 3 locations within a half-mile radius of camp. We were operating on information Connie had gathered from 2 elders in Salcha village who had described activity in that specific drainage over the previous decade. Both elders had seen large bipedal tracks in that area consistently, most often in the spring and again in late September. One of the elders, a woman named June, had described hearing what she called the deep singing on 3 separate occasions, always at night, always from the ridge above the river bar. She said it was not unpleasant. She said it reminded her of the sound the spruce trees made when a particular wind came from the northeast in late autumn, a low, low and carrying sound that was felt as much as heard. She had not been frightened by it. She had considered it, she told Connie, a sign that the country she was hunting in was healthy. We heard it ourselves for the first time on the night of July 17th, 1972. I need to be precise about the date because Elkins was precise about dates, and precision matters when you are building a record that you hope will eventually be read by people equipped to understand it. It was 2:40 in the morning, and in July in interior Alaska, 2:40 in the morning is not dark. The sun barely dips below the horizon, and the sky stays a dim gold that turns everything to shadow without erasing it. I was in my sleeping bag with the tent door partially unzipped because the inside temperature was close to 60 degrees even without a fire, and I was half awake in the particular way that fieldwork teaches you, not fully asleep, processing ambient sound automatically without waking unless the ambient pattern changes. The ambient sound changed, not abruptly. The sound built slowly from below the threshold of awareness into a sound distinct from the river noise and the wind in the spruce, a low-frequency vocalization, continuous, coming from the ridge to the north of camp. I sat up. Through the tent mesh, I could see that Cooper was already sitting upright in his bag 20 feet away, and that Elkins was already at the tree line with the binoculars and a reel-to-reel field recorder running. The sound lasted about 11 minutes. It was not a single continuous note, but a sequence of phrases, each one lasting between 10 and 30 seconds, with brief pauses between them that felt structured rather than arbitrary. Elkins got most of it on tape. Later, when we sent the recording to a linguistics professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, a man named Dr. Leonard Vance, who was doing research on Athabascan tonal systems and had a security clearance, Sproul had arranged Vance listened to the tape twice and said that the sequences showed structural regularities consistent with intentional communication. The vocalizations matched no wildlife recording in the literature he was familiar with. If he heard this tape without knowing its provenance, he would assume it was a human language he had not encountered, operating in a frequency range lower than standard human speech. He asked where it came from. Sproul thanked him for his assessment and did not answer the question. We did not hear it again that summer. But in October, when the birch had gone gold and the temperature at night was dropping below freezing and the moose were moving along the river bars in the early mornings, with their breath hanging in the cold air, our trail cameras produced the first usable images. Not from the game trail cameras, but from a remote monitoring station Elkins had set up on the ridge above camp, an automated setup that shot a frame every 30 seconds triggered by a motion sensor with a 200-foot detection range. The images came back on a roll of Kodak Tri-X black and white film. Elkins processed them in a makeshift darkroom he had set up in a corner of our supply tent, and when he laid the prints on the examination board under the red safe light and I looked at them, I understood why Sproul had spoken to us as he had, with the matter-of-fact voice of someone who had already absorbed the pressure of this. Because the pressure of it, when you see the evidence clearly for the first time, takes your breath away in a way that has nothing to do with fear. It has to do with the fundamental reorientation of everything you thought you understood about the world. There were 14 frames on the roll that showed activity. The images were grainy, taken in low evening light at the edge of the sensor's detection range, but they were unambiguous. A large bipedal figure moving through the open spruce at the top of the ridge, between two trees whose height Elkins had measured when he set up the camera rig. White spruce of 48 feet and 52 feet documented. The figure in the images was moving between them, partially obscured by branches, but the portions visible above and below the obstructions were consistent with a single upright body. Elkins calculated the visible height at between 7 feet 8 inches and 8 feet 2 inches. The stride estimated from frame spacing and the camera's interval was about 5 feet. It was not running, it was walking, moving from east to west across the frame. And in the two frames where the angle allowed a partial view of what appeared to be the front of the body, there was nothing in the posture or the movement that suggested anything other than deliberate, purposeful, fully upright locomotion. We studied those prints for weeks. Elkins made enlargements, he made measurements, he annotated each frame with technical notes on the light conditions, the apparent musculature, the limb proportions. He sent copies to Sproul's office in a sealed envelope. He filed his own copies in the metal lockbox he kept under his cot. And then he turned to me one evening in November when the temperature outside was minus 22 and the stove in the supply tent was cranked as high as it would go. And he said that whatever those images showed, it was not a bear in an upright posture. It was not a man in a costume. It was not a combination of shadows and wishful thinking, and that the implications of what he was looking at were going to require him to spend some time thinking carefully about every assumption his academic training had given him about the limits of the known world. He said it without drama, like a man taking an inventory of a situation he was not sure he had the tools to handle. Roy Elkins was the most careful man I ever worked with. He did not reach conclusions ahead of his evidence. He did not lean into what he wanted to see. For him to say what he said that November evening was the equivalent of a seismic reading. I filed it accordingly. We went back to Fort Wainwright for the winter of 72 into 73. The interior Alaska winter is not a season for field work in our mode. At minus 40, cameras fail. Recording equipment fails. The human body, even well-equipped, has a finite operating window outdoors before it begins to lose more capacity than it gains information. More importantly, the The country in deep winter is not where the activity concentrated based on what the village elders had told Connie. The winter months were quiet months. The one who walks the ridges in the traditional knowledge moved deeper and higher in winter into the mountain drainages where the game was denser and the terrain provided the thermal pockets, southward facing slopes, river canyon walls, dense conifer groves that retained heat against the worst cold. They were not hibernating. They were simply deep in a country that humans had not penetrated in winter since the time of the Athabascan people who had developed the cultural tools and physical adaptations to manage those conditions. Sproul came to our briefing in January of '73 and told us the footage and the sound recording had been reviewed at Fort Meade. He said the assessment from the analysts was that the materials were consistent with the unit's field observations and warranted continued operational investment. That was the Army's way of saying, keep going. He also told us that the unit was being expanded. 2 additional personnel were being assigned, a sergeant first class named Lester Dade, who was a medic with a background in wildlife field biology from his time before enlisting, and a contractor named Fay Holt, a botanist from the University of Alaska system who had done field research in the Brooks Range and who, Sproul said, had her own reasons for being interested in what we were doing. She had been vetted and cleared, and he trusted her. Fay Holt arrived in February and sat down at the section's briefing table and looked at Elkin's photographs and the spectrogram Vance had produced from the audio recording, and she said that she had been waiting for someone to officially confirm what she had been hearing for the past 7 years doing field work in the interior. Said with no bravado and no relief, like someone confirming a calculation they had been running in their head and have been fairly sure of for some time. Then she said she had botanical data that she believed was relevant, and she laid out a series of pressed plant samples in evidence bags on the table, each one labeled with a GPS coordinate and a date. And she told us about a pattern she had noticed in the field over years of sampling vegetation transects. In specific areas of the interior, there were what she called managed clearings. Not managed in the human sense of mechanical intervention, but managed in the sense that particular plant communities had been systematically manipulated in ways that did not correspond to any natural disturbance pattern she knew. Certain shrubs harvested cleanly from the base with no tool marks on the remaining stems, but with the cut angle consistent with a downward force rather than a lateral pull. Berries stripped from one side of a bush only, with the harvesting apparently done at a height between 6 and 8 feet above the ground. Willow stands where the small branches had been woven into structures that were not nests, not shelters in the human sense, but organized in a way that suggested intentional modification of the surrounding terrain. She said she had documented over 40 of these sites across the Tanana drainage and the lower White Mountains over 7 years of field work. She said she had mentioned it to colleagues twice and been told both times that she was probably seeing beaver activity or wind damage or the foraging patterns of bears. She said she knew the difference. She and Elkins spent the winter working with Connie on the traditional knowledge, cross-referencing the locations of the managed clearings with the historical activity areas identified in the oral traditions. The overlap was significant. Not perfect because decades had passed since many of the historical sightings had been documented in the village records Connie had access to, but consistent enough that by March of '73, we had a rough habitat map that showed primary activity concentrated in 2 main areas, the upper Salcha River drainage and the Birch Creek country north of Fairbanks in the White Mountains. Secondary activity documented less frequently in the traditional knowledge extended into the Delta River drainage south toward the Alaska Range and into the remote Charlie River country to the east. Sproul reviewed the habitat map in March and asked one question. He asked if the areas on the map corresponded to any planned operational areas for the pipeline construction or associated infrastructure. We looked at the map together. The Birch Creek drainage and the upper Salcha were not on the pipeline route. The Delta River area was adjacent to the Richardson Highway corridor that would be used for construction access, but not directly in the pipeline's path. Sproul said good and told us to plan our summer '73 operations with primary focus on the Birch Creek drainage. I will tell you what I think his concern was because I have had 50 years to think about it. The Army had, by late 1972, confirmed through field observation and physical evidence and cultural documentation that there was a large intelligent bipedal species operating in the interior of Alaska. They did not know its population size. They did not know its range limits. They did not know how it would respond to the industrial disruption that the Trans-Alaska Pipeline construction, which began in earnest in 1974, would bring to the interior. They did not know, and this is the part that military intelligence is constitutionally required to try to know, what the threat profile of an encounter between construction crews and this species might look like if an encounter happened and was not managed. Our unit was, in part, an early warning system, not for the Army's protection only, for the species protection as well, though that framing was never used officially because it would have required the Army to officially acknowledge a species it had every reason to keep unacknowledged. The Birch Creek drainage runs through the White Mountains, the chain of hills and ridges north of Fairbanks that are more modest in scale than the Alaska Range to the south, but no less remote. The White Mountains National Recreation Area did not exist yet. It was established much later in 1980, and in the early 70s, the country north of Fairbanks was managed as part of the Bureau of Land Management's vast, undifferentiated Alaska holdings. You could drive north from Fairbanks on the Steese Highway for about 60 miles and then take the 12-mile Summit Road into the high country, and from there the drainage opened up into a country that, in my memory, still holds a particular quality of remoteness that I have not found anywhere else in a lifetime of field experience. The mountains there are not dramatic by Alaska Range standards. They are rounded, heavily timbered on the lower slopes with white spruce opening to alpine tundra above treeline and cut by creek drainages that run clear and cold over gravel beds in summer and freeze solid from the bottom up in winter. It is the kind of country that looks manageable from a distance and reveals its true character only when you are inside it. We put into the Birch Creek drainage in early June of '73, using a bush plane that landed on a gravel bar about 30 miles from the nearest road. The pilot, a man out of Fairbanks named Dale Voss, who had flown the interior for 20 years and never asked unnecessary questions, dropped us in our gear and was back in the air before the prop wash had settled. 6 of us with supplies for 30 days. Elkins, Cooper, Connie, Faye, Dade, and me. The first 2 weeks were baseline work. Faye documented the vegetation, cataloging the same patterns of managed clearings she had found in the Salcha drainage. Cooper ran the cache networks along the creek, setting up supply caches that would let us extend our operations without resupply flights that would draw attention. Elkins set cameras and audio recorders. Dade, who, in addition to his medical training, had a quality of stillness in the field that I had rarely encountered, began tracking. Not with cameras or instrumentation, but with the old skills, reading ground, reading vegetation, reading the small disturbances that accumulate when a large body moves through country regularly. Dade found the latrine sites on the 8th day. This sounds like an unglamorous detail, but it matters enormously in terms of what it tells you about a species. Animals that do not dig do not bury waste. Animals with significant intelligence and social structure often do. What Dade found in 3 locations along the creek were excavated pits, roughly 18 inches in diameter and about 10 inches deep, dug with what appeared to be a digging tool of some kind and covered over with displaced soil when used. The soil around the pits showed no sign of claw marks. The digging had been done with something that had a broad, flat face, stone or bone, not the narrow, pointed dig pattern of a bear's claws. The deposits themselves, and I apologize for the clinical detail, but it is clinically relevant, showed a diet that was omnivorous and varied, including plant material, fish bone and scale residue, and small mammal hair, but also evidence of food processing. Chewed plant fiber in quantities and configurations that suggested it had been chewed with purpose, as in a food preparation process rather than random browsing. The deposits also contained ash, a small amount, as if the food being consumed had been in proximity to fire. Dade and Elkins spent 2 days at each site. Faye took samples. I documented with photographs. Connie sat a respectful distance back and said nothing, but her expression when she saw the ash-containing deposits was one of recognition rather than surprise. When I asked her about it, one of the Salcha elders had mentioned in a conversation she had not thought to bring to our briefings because she had assumed it was metaphorical, that the one who walks the ridges was known to use fire. not to build it the way humans do, not with deliberate fire starting, but to carry fire, to transport burning material and maintain it in the way that the Athabascan people themselves had done in the deep past before reliable fire starting tools were widespread. She said the elder had described in the language a concept that translated roughly as keeper of the living coal. She said it had always been interpreted as a ceremonial or spiritual designation. She was no longer sure it had ever been metaphorical at all. I sat with that information for a long time. The use of maintained fire, not spontaneous fire starting, but the deliberate transport and preservation of an existing fire implies a cognitive level that is difficult to overstate. It implies planning across time, understanding of causality, the capacity to assign value to an object and protect that value across movement and changing conditions. It implies, in the language of anthropology that Elkins used, significant executive function. This was not an incidental action. This was a being that understood what fire was, what it was for, and how to maintain it. On the 19th day, we found a structure. I have been building toward this, and I want to describe it accurately because accuracy matters more than impact here. What we found was not a shelter in any human architectural sense. It was a construction, and the distinction is important. Located in a dense stand of white spruce about 400 yards from the creek, partially screened by a natural windfall that had created a tunnel of fallen trees. It consisted of several large spruce trunks, none of them recently cut, all of them natural deadfall, repositioned to form a rough semicircle against the windfall. The trunks were not the largest in the area. They had been selected for size and straightness, which implied sorting. They had been moved, which, given their diameter, implied something capable of moving them. The smallest trunk I could get my arms around. Elkins and I together could not shift it. Within the semicircle, the ground had been cleared of debris and covered with a layer of spruce boughs, fresh enough that the needles had not fully dried. On top of the boughs were 3 flat stones arranged in a rough triangle, and in the center of the triangle was ash. Recent ash, gray and fine, with a small circle of discolored stone in the center that indicated continuous heat. This fire had been burning within the last 48 hours based on the ash's moisture content, which Faye assessed from feel and visual inspection. On the windfall above the sleeping platform, and it was a sleeping platform, Elkins said, with quiet certainty after examining the impressions in the boughs, there was a series of marks, scratches in the bark of a horizontal trunk, made with a hard edge or point in patterns that did not appear random. They were not symbolic in any way I could interpret. They were not pictographs or representations of anything I recognized, but they were organized, they repeated, they were arranged in sets of 3 and 4 with spacing between the sets that was consistent across the span of the trunk. And Elkins said after 20 minutes of examination that if you showed him these marks without context, he would assume they were records of some kind, tallies, counts, events being tracked across time because the marks showed different ages, different depths of weathering in the bark, indicating they had been made over an extended period, not all at once. We did not camp at the structure. We pulled back to our camp on the creek and held a long conversation, the 6 of us, about what we had and what it meant and what we should do next. Connie made a point that has stayed with me. In the traditional knowledge, the one who walks the ridges was known to have a strong sense of territory and a strong sense of what had been disturbed in their territory. She said the elders believed they could smell the presence of humans from a significant distance and that they would know we had been at the structure even if we had tried to leave it as we found it, which we had. She said that in the traditional understanding, this knowledge on their part would not necessarily produce aggression. It would produce caution, and possibly over time a third outcome. I asked her what that third outcome was. In the old accounts, the cases where continuous contact with the Tanana people had occurred, not just sightings but ongoing presence in shared territory, the beings had eventually begun to behave in ways that the elders interpreted as deliberate communication. Food left at the edge of a camp that had not been there the night before, a structure that a hunter had built that was modified or repaired while the hunter slept. The same sounds heard in the same places over consecutive seasons, in patterns that seemed to acknowledge the human presence rather than ignore it. She said the elders had not considered these contacts supernatural. They had considered them the behavior of a species that was deciding how much trust to extend. I asked Connie if she thought we were being watched. She said we had been watched since the day we arrived. She said it with certainty, but not alarm, the way you tell someone they left their jacket in the car, a fact she considered already established and not particularly troubling. We stayed in the Birch Creek drainage for 11 days beyond the initial planned 30, resupplied by a bush plane drop that Voss made on the gravel bar we had originally landed on. In those additional days, three things happened that I'm going to describe carefully. The first was audio. On the night of July the 14th, the recording equipment Elkins had set up on the ridge above our camp caught a sequence of vocalizations that lasted 43 minutes, not continuous. Phrases, as I said before, with pauses between them that Elkins, listening to the recording afterward, identified as response spaces. As if the vocalizations were half of a conversation, the gaps left open for a reply that was either beyond the equipment's range or being communicated in a mode the equipment could not capture. Vance, when he later received the recording, said that several of the recurring tonal patterns appeared in multiple positions throughout the sequence in ways that were consistent with reference, using the same sound to point to the same concept in different contexts. He called it indexical function. He said it was a property of language. The second thing was the structure. We went back to it on the 23rd day and found it had been modified. A fourth flat stone had been added to the triangle, making it a rectangle. The bow layer on the sleeping platform had been partially renewed with fresh spruce boughs laid over the older dried ones. And on the bark of the windfall, beside the existing marks, new ones had been added. 3 marks in a fresh section of bark recently scored, the white wood still pale and damp smelling, 3 marks and then a gap, and then a single mark and then another gap, and then what Elkins called a separator, a horizontal line crossing all the others, which in every human counting system he was aware of represented a grouping, the close of a sequence, the end of a count. The third thing was that Lester Dade, who had been running a solo transect along the northern fork of the creek on the 28th day, came back to camp in the early afternoon of that day and said, in his quiet way, that he wanted to tell us about his morning. While he was following the creek north of the canyon section, he had heard movement behind him in the spruce and had stopped and turned and seen something standing about 60 feet back on the game trail he had been following. He said it was very large, standing upright, and that its hair was dark. He said the color of strong coffee in dim light, and that it was standing still and looking at him. He said they looked at each other for perhaps 30 seconds, and that the being did not make any sound or move toward him or move away. After 30 seconds, it simply stepped sideways into the spruce and was gone. He said the spruce closed behind it and he heard nothing. No crashing, no snapping of branches, no retreat, silence. I asked Dade if he had been afraid. Dade had been scared initially, as any living creature is startled when a very large thing appears unexpectedly, but that the fear had passed quickly because there was nothing in the posture or the gaze that suggested threat. The look had been assessing. He paused and then said it reminded him of the look a very large dog gives you when it is trying to decide if you are a friend of its family or not. He said the decision seemed to be neither yes nor no. It seemed to be more time needed. We flew out of the Birch Creek drainage on August 3rd, 1973. I was 30 years old. I had been in the field with the section for 20 months. And I understood flying over that country in Dale Voss's Cessna at 2,000 feet, looking down at the drainage where we had spent 41 days, that I was involved in something that was going to occupy the rest of my working life and possibly beyond, and that the question of how to handle that information responsibly was one that nobody had given me any guidance on, because nobody had anticipated being in the position of needing to ask it. We briefed Sprule in August. He listened to the recordings and examined the photographs and read our field reports, and he said at the end of a 2-hour session that the file would be forwarded to Fort Meade under the highest available classification, and that operational parameters for the section would be reviewed at the senior level, and that we should continue current field protocols and await further guidance. He also said that the section's budget allocation was being increased for fiscal year 74 and that 2 additional personnel slots were being authorized. He said this without elaboration, which was his way of communicating that the people at Fort Meade had seen what we sent them and were not treating it as the work of people who had spent too long in the bush. The following 2 years, 73 and 74, were the years of greatest institutional attention to our work. The pipeline construction had begun in earnest, and the activity in the corridor between Fairbanks and Valdez was intense. We were running parallel operations, maintaining our observation and documentation in the primary zones while also making rapid surveys of areas adjacent to the construction activity to monitor for disruptions. What we found in those surveys was a pattern that became one of the most consistent findings in the unit's entire 24-year operational history. The species moved laterally away from construction disturbance. They did not flee in panic. They relocated methodically, shifting their primary range to the east of the pipeline corridor, deeper into the drainage systems that the construction was not penetrating. Fay tracked this through vegetation evidence, the managed clearings appearing and disappearing in different locations across consecutive seasons. Connie tracked it through conversations in the Athabascan villages, noting which settlements along the Tanana were reporting more activity and which fewer. The pattern was consistent with an intelligent assessment of the disturbance zone and a deliberate decision to avoid it without crossing into the kind of frantic dispersal that would produce the random sightings and conflict encounters that the Army had been, I believe, quietly concerned about. Connie had a name for what she was observing. She called it accommodation. She said that in the traditional knowledge, this was what the one who walks the ridges had always done when humans expanded into new territory. They accommodated. They moved to the edges of the human zone and continued to exist there in the spaces between, watching and adjusting and never quite gone. She said it was, in the traditional interpretation, a form of patience so deep it had no human equivalent. She said the elders believed they were waiting for something, not for humans to leave, because they had understood long ago that humans did not leave. They were waiting for humans to settle, to stop spreading and begin living in the places they had already taken so that the remaining spaces might hold. I am not a philosophical man by nature. 23 years of military intelligence work does not cultivate philosophical thinking, but I have thought about what Connie said about waiting many times over the years since, and I believe she was right in a way that goes beyond the traditional framework she was describing. What the species had done in the face of human expansion was not surrender, and it was not resistance. It was a strategy more sophisticated than either. It was the long game played by a species with a cognitive capacity and a time horizon that humans with our fourscore-year lives and our quarterly budget cycles are not structurally equipped to understand. In the winter of 1974, Roy Elkins submitted a formal recommendation to Sproul, requesting that the section pursue what he called direct engagement protocols. By this, he meant a systematic attempt to initiate deliberate, ongoing communication with the species, rather than continuing purely in observation mode. He argued that our accumulated data strongly suggested the species was already aware of our presence and had made a deliberate decision to allow proximity. The modification of the structure, Dade's direct encounter, the evidence of continued activity in areas where our camera equipment was set up. Despite the camera equipment being detectable by any sufficiently sensitive nose, all of it pointed to a population that had assessed our team and determined we were not a threat. Elkins believed the next step was to respond to that assessment in kind, to signal back. Sproul forwarded the recommendation to Fort Meade, and the response came back in 6 weeks, approved with conditions. The conditions were that any engagement protocol be designed specifically to avoid physical contact, to avoid any action that could be construed as capture or sampling attempt, and to be immediately suspended if there was any indication of distress or aggression on the part of the species. The word used in the authorization document was respect. An unusual word to find in a military operational authorization, but it was there, and whoever wrote it understood something important about what we were dealing with. Elkins designed the protocol over the winter. Connie contributed to it heavily, drawing on the traditional knowledge about what types of human behavior had historically preceded positive versus negative encounters with the species. The core principle was simple: reciprocity. We would place items at locations we knew to be active, and we would leave, and we would document whether and how those items were engaged with. We would not attempt to observe the engagement in real time. We would give the full space of whatever night elapsed and return to see what had happened. Connie insisted on this specifically. She said that in the traditional understanding, direct observation during the reciprocal exchange was considered a violation of the agreement that the exchange implied. You offered something, you withdrew, you returned. This was the pattern that had characterized every account of positive contact in the village histories she had reviewed. The first item we placed was a piece of smoked salmon, not canned, not processed in any industrial way. Connie had brought it from a Tanana village, produced in the traditional manner over an alder fire wrapped in birch bark. We placed it on the flat stone at the center of the structure we had found in the Birch Creek drainage. We left. We came back 18 hours later. The salmon was gone. On the stone where it had rested was a piece of bone, clean, worked smooth on one surface, about 6 inches long and roughly the width of 2 fingers. Fay identified it as caribou femur. The shaft section and the smooth surface was not natural but worked, polished by repeated handling over a significant period. It was an old piece, not a fresh bone from a recent kill, something that had been kept. I held it in my hand and tried to understand what I was being told. That is the correct framing, I think, what I was being told, because the placement was too specific to be incidental. We had placed a food item. We had received in return something that was not food, something that was old and handled and personal, in the way that old things carried by an individual become personal. An exchange of gifts between two parties who are, for the first time, explicitly acknowledging each other's existence. Elkins cataloged the bone with the precision he brought to everything. Dade examined it with the eye of someone trained to assess biological material. He said the working of the surface had been done by a broad, flat, abrasive, likely sandstone, and that the pattern of the working suggested the piece had been held in a grip during the polishing process, the marks radiating from a center point consistent with a palm and finger grip significantly larger than a human hand. Fay said the bone was most likely at least 2 decades old, based on the degree of surface weathering and the calcification patterns in the marrow channel. Cooper looked at it and said nothing for a long time, and then said that his father had kept a piece of moose bone for 30 years on the windowsill of the trapping cabin because it was from the first moose his father had taken as a boy, and he considered it a kind of proof. He said giving something like that to someone else was not a small gesture. We continued the exchange protocol for the remainder of that season and into the 75 and 76 operational periods. I am not going to enumerate every exchange in detail because there were many of them, and because the cumulative pattern was more significant than any individual episode. What I will say is that the exchanges became more complex over time. The items we received were not random. They responded in ways that required us to think carefully about interpretation to the items we had offered. We gave food, we received something functional. We gave something functional, a hand tool, a basic one, a small folding knife that Connie suggested and that I was skeptical about. We received something that appeared to be a component of a larger tool, a length of bone worked at one end into a point and fitted with a groove that would have accepted a stone blade. We gave nothing 1 week, simply returning to the site to observe, and the site was empty. No deposits of any kind, the absence as pointed as the presence had been. The first spring that Glenn Hartley had been in Alaska, this is a habit I developed in the field, referring to myself in the third person when I was doing mental inventory, a dissociation technique the Army psychologist at Fort Meade would later tell me was common in long-term intelligence field work. The first spring in Alaska, I had thought the country was empty. By the spring of 1976, I understood it was full, and that the fullness I had missed was not incidental. It was the result of a species that had spent thousands of years learning to exist in proximity to humans while remaining invisible to them, not because they were afraid, because they had decided that visibility was not safe. And now, through the accumulation of salmon and bone and folding knives and workstone, through the careful reciprocity of a protocol designed by an anthropologist and an Athabascan cultural liaison and 3 years of field observation, the calculation was changing. I turned 28 in June of 76. Connie told me around that time that she had something she needed to share with the section that she had been holding back because she was not sure the time was right, and that she now believed the time was right. One of the elders in Minto, Thomas, the man who had spoken to me in my first spring at Fort Wainwright, had asked to speak with the section collectively, not through her as intermediary, directly. He had, she told us, information about the individual we had been exchanging items with in the Birch Creek drainage. Thomas had a way of knowing things about the activity in the deep country that she had never fully understood but had learned to trust, and that he had used a specific word in the traditional language when he described this individual. The word meant, she translated, something like the one who watches from the same hill over many seasons. She said it was a designation that, in the traditional context, indicated an individual who had been observed by the Tanana people over a long span of time. Not the species generally, this specific one. We drove to Minto the following week. Thomas sat across from 6 Army and contractor personnel in a small room that smelled of wood smoke and dried fish, and he told us, through Connie, that the individual we had been exchanging items with was known to the Minto people. He had been known to them for a long time. The elder's grandfather had described an encounter with this individual in the upper Tolovana drainage in the early part of the century, and that the description of the individual then, the color of the hair, near black with silver at the shoulders, the particular gait, the preference for the northern creek drainages, matched what we had documented in our photographs and field observations. If the description was accurate, this individual was very old by human reckoning. In the traditional knowledge, the one who walks the ridges did not count years as humans did, and that their natural lifespan was believed to extend far beyond what any human could achieve. This specific individual had a name in the Tanana language that he would not translate because names in that tradition carried obligations he did not think the Army was prepared to accept. But he said that this individual had, in his grandfather's time and in the accounts passed down through the intervening generations, shown a consistent quality that Thomas described as the closest thing to curiosity about humans that any of the species had demonstrated in his people's knowledge. I asked Thomas what he thought we should do. He looked at Connie and then at me, and he said, with the care of someone choosing words that will carry weight, that the question was not what we should do. The question was what we were willing to become. He said that the one who walks the ridges would not trust people who came only to take, but they had shown in his people's experience the capacity to extend the quality of recognition to people who came to remain, to be present over time in the same places in the same ways reliably. He said what the section had been doing for the past 4 years was, in the traditional framework, the equivalent of knocking on a door and then standing outside waiting to be invited in. The door was beginning to open. That did not mean we should rush. The years between the Thomas visit and my last field deployment in September of 1994 were 20 years of the most methodical, most careful, and most personally transformative work I have ever been part of. I cannot tell you all of it in the space available, so I will tell you the parts that shaped everything that came after. In the summer of 1976, Lester Dade proposed the first overnight stay protocol. A single person, no tent, small fire, no concealment. At Connie's instruction, Dade stayed near the structure in Birch Creek for a single night and produced nothing but a small fire and his presence. In the morning, on the flat rock between his sleeping position and the structure, was a piece of worked obsidian 4 inches long, pressure flaked on both faces from the Batsatina source near the Koyukuk River, 150 miles away. Faye identified it that morning. The room she and Elkins and I were standing in was, in that moment, the entire population of human beings who understood what had just happened. I want to say something about sound in that country because sound is how the interior speaks most clearly. In late September, the creek runs lower than in summer, the snowmelt long gone and the water is clarified and individual stones become audible beneath it. The wind through bare birch branches has no softening from leaves and is directional and clear. When the aurora is bright and the temperature drops below -10, you can sometimes hear a faint crackling that the Athabascan people have described for centuries as the sound of the sky speaking. I heard it on the night of my first direct encounter, and I heard it again in 2022. Both times it came in at the same moment, above the creek and the wind and the voices from the ridge, as if the country itself was acknowledging what was happening within it. Elkins had documented in the field journals the species' use of frequency in ways that were functionally related to the terrain. The lowest frequency vocalizations carried through dense spruce over long distances. The higher frequency sounds used in close proximity exchanges were masked by running water at 100 yards and became essentially private within that range. He believed the species understood this acoustically, that they chose frequencies as a person chooses a volume of voice based on who they want to hear them. The field journals from 1981 onward showed sequences of the same vocalization pattern at different frequencies as the same pair of individuals moved from creek bottom to ridgeline and back, the frequency shifting consistently with the distance and the ambient noise floor. It was the most technical piece of evidence Elkins produced in 20 years of work. He called it frequency adaptive communication. He said it was indistinguishable in its functional sophistication from the acoustic awareness of any species that has spent millennia optimizing its communication for a specific environment. In the summer of 1979, Dade reported that the structure was producing sounds he had not documented before. Tender sounds, he called them, lower in frequency than the standard vocalizations coming from inside the structure rather than from the ridge. 2 weeks later, when we went back to the flat stone, there was a nest of woven willow lined with birch inner bark and fine dark hair, about 18 inches across, with a small depression in its center that I could have covered with my open hand. Connie looked at it for a long time and said that in the traditional knowledge, when the one who walks the ridges left something of this kind, it was considered a name, a way of saying this person exists, this person is known. We pulled back immediately and stayed out for 2 weeks. Whatever the structure sheltered during that period, we gave it the space the traditional knowledge said was required. When we returned, the nest was gone. The exchange continued. By the mid-1980s, 6 distinct individuals were documented in the primary activity area. The exchange protocol had produced hundreds of items in both directions. The section had recorded over 200 hours of vocalizations, and the individual we had been in contact with longest, the one Thomas had said was known to the Minto people across generations, showed no signs of the aging that 2 decades of field observation should have made evident. The silver at the shoulders had spread slightly from the early photographs. Everything else was consistent. In March of 1995, the Army closed the section. 6 months before the closure, I made a final deployment. I went in alone, 3 weeks, the offering on the flat stone, the waiting, the vocalizations from the ridge on the 5th night. And then, after 2 hours of near silence, footsteps coming down from the ridge, heavy and unhurried, ending at the edge of my firelight. I looked up. What stood at the edge of my firelight was not a shape or a silhouette or a form that I processed gradually, piece by piece, the way you process a complex image in low light by building it from its parts. What stood there was a presence, whole and entire, that registered all at once, the way a door opening does. There and then, more there. No transition. It was large. I had known it would be large. I had spent 19 years with the measurements and the photographs and Dade's field reports, but knowing and standing within 30 feet of are 2 different things, and I had known this, and it still required me to adjust. Not in fear, but in the particular physical recalibration that happens when the scale of a thing in your proximity exceeds what your previous experience has calibrated you for. Like standing for the first time at the base of a mountain you have looked at from a distance for years. The scale is not new information, but the body receives it differently. I sat still. I did not stand. Standing can look like a challenge when you are significantly shorter than what you are standing across from, and 19 years of field protocol had become reflex by then. The hair was dark, near black, with the silver I had seen in the distant photographs now visible clearly in the firelight as a band of lighter color across the shoulders and partway down the upper arms. The face was in shadow, mostly the firelight coming from the wrong angle to illuminate it well, but I could see the heavy brow and the deep-set eyes, and the eyes caught and held the firelight the way certain animals' eyes catch light, a brief reddish-gold reflection when the angle was right. It was standing with its hands at its sides, arms slightly away from the body in the posture that I had come to understand from Connie's framing of the traditional knowledge as the neutral stance, not aggressive, not submissive, simply present. I did not speak. I had not planned what I would do in this moment because I had not allowed myself to plan for it as a concrete possibility rather than a theoretical one, and now that it was happening, I found that the absence of a plan was not a problem. The protocol had always been clear. You offered, you withdrew, you returned. But we had reached a new step, and the new step was this. You stayed, you sat beside your fire, and you stayed. I kept my hands where they could be seen, and I looked at the fire rather than at it because continuous direct eye contact in most species reads as challenge, and I had no way of knowing whether that held here or not, and the conservative choice was obvious. After what I estimate was 3 minutes of stillness in which neither of us moved and the only sounds were the creak below the bench and the small settling of the fire coals, it sat down. Not on the ground exactly. It lowered itself into a crouch that read as sitting with its forearms resting across its knees. The posture brought it lower, reducing the height differential between us, which I registered as deliberate, as consideration, as an act of conscious adjustment to the interaction. I took a slow breath and let it out and focused on keeping my respiration normal because an elevated respiratory rate is detectable by any sufficiently acute nose and would read as agitation or fear. I was not afraid. I want to be clear about this, not because I need you to believe I was brave, but because it is accurate, and the accuracy matters. I was present, fully, entirely present, the way you are present at the death of someone you love, where everything else simply falls away and there is only this. I became aware of sound, not the vocalizations from the ridge. This was close, coming from the crouching figure across the fire, a low hum that was below clear hearing range, but above what I could dismiss as the wind or the creak. I felt it first in my chest before I could hear it as a distinct sound, which is the nature of sounds at the low end of the audible spectrum. The hum was not continuous at a single frequency. It moved, it cycled through a set of tones in a pattern that I could not follow completely, but that had a clear beginning and a clear end, and then a pause, and then began again in a variation. Not the same, but related. The way a theme in music develops, the same chord shape expressing itself differently. I did not respond vocally. I was not equipped to. What I did was reach slowly into my jacket pocket where I had placed a small piece of the smoked salmon before sitting down that evening, a habit I had developed over years of overnight stays, and I took it out and I placed it on the flat rock beside my fire. I did not offer it toward the figure. I set it on the rock the way you set a plate on a table for someone who is sitting across from you, an act of ordinary hospitality rather than an extended transaction. The hum continued for another minute. Then it stopped. Then the figure reached across the space between us, which at the crouch was perhaps 15 feet, and I watched an arm extend that was long in proportion to the torso, ending in a hand that was broad across the palm and wide in the fingers, and the hand took the salmon from the rock. Took it with a gentleness that I can only compare to the way you pick up a sleeping child without waking them. Then it withdrew and straightened from the crouch and stood, and without any other gesture or sound, it turned and walked back into the spruce behind the firelight. I sat there for a long time afterward. The aurora had come out while we sat together, the green curtains moving slow and enormous across the northern sky, and the birch trees on the slope above me were silver in the aurora light and black in their shadows. The creek was running cold and clear below the bench. The fire was almost out. I did not rebuild it. I sat in the cooling dark and I tried to put into some kind of order what had happened, and I could not, because the event itself was too simple to organize. We had sat across a fire. I had offered food. Food had been accepted. We had shared the silence and the aurora and the sound of a creek at night. That was all. And somehow, that was also the culmination of 19 years of work by 6 people who had believed on varying days and to varying degrees of certainty that what they were doing mattered in ways that would outlast their careers and possibly their lives. In the morning, there was nothing on the flat rock where the salmon had been. There was nothing at the structure. I waited out the full 3 remaining weeks of my deployment, running my observations, documenting what I could, leaving my offerings, and finding them taken, and finding whatever was left in return. During those 3 weeks, there were 3 more overnight presences near my camp, each one at a distance further than the first, brief periods of the low hum and then the withdrawal. And on the last night, the night before I was scheduled to fly out with Dale Voss on the gravel bar, there were two distinct humming voices, slightly different in frequency, one of them the one I had now come to recognize and one I had not heard before. They were not at the fire this time. They were on the ridge above my camp, and the exchange between them lasted about 40 minutes. And though I could not come close to parsing the meaning, the emotional quality of what I heard reached me clearly. It had the quality of assessment, of consideration, of two people discussing a third who is not in the room. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened and felt the aurora's colors moving behind my closed eyes, and I thought about Thomas and Minto telling me that the question was not what we should do, but what we were willing to become. And I thought that the answer to that question had taken 19 years to arrive and was arriving now, in the dark, in a drainage in the White Mountains, in a conversation I could not understand between beings who had made a calculation about me that I would never have access to. The calculation was being made. The fact of it was enough. I flew out on September 29th, 1994. Voss landed on the gravel bar and helped me load my gear, and we lifted off into the October sky. The birch, a yellow river below us, and the spruce dark on the ridges, and the creek running silver in the low-angled morning light. I looked down at the bench above the creek until the Cessna's altitude and direction took it from my line of sight, and there was only the country, spread out in every direction, enormous and unhurried and full, in ways that I had spent 23 years learning to read. The months between my September departure and the section's official closure in 30 September of 95 were occupied differently than any other period in my career. I had a desk assignment in Fairbanks, administrative duties, the standard last year work of an officer completing a rotation. But the real work of those months was internal, processing 19 years, trying to build a framework for what the section's operational life had meant and what it owed the world when it closed. Sproul called me in January of 95 before the official closure notification came and told me that the section's operational files were being reviewed at the Fort Meade level. He said the review was routine, connected to the post-Cold War reorganization, and that there was no indication the files would be actioned in any way that would change their classification status. He said this carefully, with the specific precision of a man who knows that what he is not saying is at least as important as what he is saying. What he was not saying was that the files were being buried deeper, that the classification tier was being increased, that the institutional pathway to those files already narrow was being made narrower in a way that would effectively remove them from the active retrieval universe of anyone without specific prior knowledge of the program. I asked him why. The reasoning given internally was that the materials were too significant to leave in a classification tier that could be accessed through a standard FOIA process in 30 years when the standard release schedules came due. The argument made by the people managing the decision was that the species safety required the higher classification, that if the files became public through the normal declassification process, the effect on the species and on the communities who had protected their knowledge for generations would be worse than continued concealment. I told him I thought that argument was right and wrong simultaneously. Right that the files needed protection, wrong that the protection could be indefinite without creating its own form of harm. He said he agreed with me and that he had made that argument in the review process and lost. He said, "Glenn, we are not the last word on this." He said it as a man says a thing he needs to believe and is not entirely sure he does. What I understood in the months after that conversation was that the responsibility was shifting, not from the institution to no one, from the institution to the individuals who had done the work. The institution was closing the door and dropping the key behind a wall it intended no one to scale. That meant the knowledge, the real knowledge, the experiential and the relational rather than the photographic and the documentary was now resident only in the living personnel of the section, and the living personnel were aging. Elkins was 57, Cooper was in his mid-70s, Connie was 60, Fay was 53, Dade was gone, Sproul was 66 and already showing the early signs of the cardiovascular problems that would take him in 2001. I was 47 years old and the youngest of the original roster. The arithmetic of the situation was not complicated. In 30 or 40 years, everyone who had done the work would be dead, and the files would be entombed under a classification that no one living would know to look for, and the truth of what the section had spent 24 years establishing would exist only in the institutional memory of a species that had been managing the complexity of its own existence for far longer than any government had existed, and that did not need the Army's records to confirm its own reality. The ones who would lose the record were us. The institutional amnesia would belong to us, not to them. I thought about this through the winter of 94 into 95, sitting in my quarters at Fort Wainwright in the dark of an interior Alaska February. And I made a decision that I kept private for nearly 30 years. I would tell the truth when I was free to do so, without causing the specific harms that the classification was designed to prevent. I would wait for the institutional protections that Sproul had described to age past their usefulness. I would wait for the living personnel to reach the end of their careers and make their own choices about what they owed. And then I would speak. It took longer than I thought. Institutional classifications do not expire, the humans protecting them do. And the truth has its own timeline, which is not the same as the timeline of the institution that tried to contain it. The section formally closed on September 30th, 1995. I was 47 years old and I had no idea what to do with myself. I spent the first year after the closure in a kind of professional disorientation that I was not prepared for. I had other assignments, other intelligence work, the normal continuation of an Army career that had other dimensions beyond the section, but the other work felt thin. It felt like the work of a different person, which in some ways it was. A person who had not spent 19 summers on gravel bars and creek benches listening to the country tell him things he was barely qualified to receive. I retired from the Army in 2001 at 53 years old with 31 years of service and a set of memories that I could not discuss with my colleagues at my retirement party. Eleanor was there, my wife of 24 years, and she stood beside me and shook hands with generals and smoked out contractors and said all the appropriate things. And later that evening, when we were home and the house was quiet, she asked me if I was all right. I said I was. She knew I wasn't and said I didn't have to be and that she would wait. She always waited. She was a patient woman in the way that strong people are patient from choice rather than inability to act. And she waited nearly 3 years before I told her the full truth of what the section had been. I told her on a winter evening in 2004, sitting in the kitchen of our house in Fairbanks where we had stayed after my retirement because Eleanor had grown attached to the interior and because I had reasons of my own that I had not been able to articulate. She listened for 2 hours while I described the section's work, starting from the conference room with Sproul in 1971 and ending with the September of 74, which was as far as I could get that night before the pressure of it required me to stop. She did not interrupt. She did not express disbelief. When I finished, she made 2 cups of tea and set mine down in front of me and said that this explained a great many things she had spent 20 years compiling and setting aside. The way I listened to the country had always seemed different, she told me. She had assumed it was the training. Now she understood it was also the having heard. I finished the full account over the next several evenings. Eleanor asked questions that were precise and practical in the way of a woman who had spent her career as a psychiatric nurse and knew how to take a history without leading the witness. She asked about the physical evidence, about the analytical assessments, about the chain of custody for the materials we had collected. She asked about the traditional knowledge and how Connie had represented it. She asked about Elkins's academic assessment of the vocalizations. She asked about the exchange protocol and what we understood its limits to be. And she asked me on the 4th evening what I believed, not what the evidence suggested, what I believed. I told her that I believed the species was real and had been real for longer than any human institution had been real, and that its persistence in the interior of Alaska and across whatever range it occupied was not an accident, but a product of intelligence and adaptation and a relationship with the land that humans had once had and largely lost. I told her I believed that what we had been part of in this section was not a military surveillance operation, whatever the paperwork said. It was a contact event managed badly by the institution that authorized it, but managed as well as any of us could manage it personally. I told her I believed that the being I had sat across the fire from in September of '74 was still alive, not because I had evidence of this, because Connie had told me, based on what Thomas had said in Minto, that the lifespan of the species did not map to human timelines, and because the individual we had been in continuous contact with for nearly 20 years had shown no signs of age-related decline in that period, and because I had no evidence to believe otherwise. I told her I believed that in the Birch Creek drainage in the White Mountains north of Fairbanks, in the country I had spent the best part of my working life learning to read, there was a being who had decided across 2.5 decades that the humans who kept coming back to the same place and leaving salmon on a flat stone and not shooting anything were worth the complexity of proximity. I told her I believed this mattered. She reached across the kitchen table and put her hand on mine and said that, yes, it did. She was glad I had told her. She wished I had told her sooner, and she understood why I hadn't, and understanding and wishing, she said, were two things that could coexist without either one canceling the other out. She was right about that, as she was right about most things. I miss her every day. After Eleanor passed in 2019, I spent a period of time in a kind of stillness that I do not want to dramatize, but that I also do not want to minimize. She had been the one person outside the section with whom I could speak honestly about everything I had been part of, and her absence created a silence in my daily life that was different in quality from any other silence I had known, including the deepest silences of the interior at -40 with the aurora overhead. That silence had been full. The silence after Eleanor was empty in a way I had not previously understood emptiness to be. I began in that period to think seriously about what I owed, not as a matter of guilt or obligation in the legal sense, as a matter of the record. I was 71 years old, the last surviving member of the original section roster, the only person alive who had been present for the full arc of the unit's existence and who retained both the memory and the clearance to understand what the files, buried under classification tiers that may outlast the institutional memory of why they were classified, actually contained. I contacted Fay Holt, who was at that point 80 years old and still resident in Fairbanks, and we had a series of phone calls over several months that I consider among the most important conversations of my life. Fay had not spoken about the section to anyone other than her husband, who had died in 2012, and she was as sharpened by the subject as she had always been, her botanical mind still organizing the evidence into taxonomies and patterns with the same precision she had brought to the managed clearings in 1973. She said that the discipline she had spent 60 years practicing, the study of plant communities as records of interaction between organisms over time, had given her a framework for thinking about what the section had documented that she had never managed to articulate to anyone who lacked that background. What we had witnessed, she said, was a keystone relationship. The way certain species in a healthy ecosystem structure the environment for all other species, not because they intend to, but because their presence and their behaviors have ripple effects that organize the community around them. In the drainages where the section had documented activity, the plant community was measurably different from adjacent drainages without that activity, and that the difference was in the direction of greater biodiversity and greater structural complexity. She said that in her botanical interpretation, the managed clearings and the selective harvesting patterns were functioning as disturbance events that created the mosaic of vegetation types that supported higher overall species diversity. She said the species was, in the traditional ecological sense of the term, gardening, not intentionally in the human agricultural sense. But through their movement and their use of the land, they were maintaining a kind of ecological complexity that their territory would not support without them. I had known Faye for 50 years, and she had never failed to give me a perspective I had not had before. I told her that was true, and that I had come to believe in the years since the section closed that the absence we had imposed on that country by stopping the exchange protocol was a loss on both sides, not equivalent losses. The species was resilient in ways that ours was not, but still a loss. Faye said she agreed and that she had thought about it often. On her most recent visit to the Birch Creek drainage in the fall of 2015, she had gone in alone and left a jar of smoked salmon on the flat stone beside the structure. When she returned the following morning, the jar was gone. She had stood there in the morning light looking at the empty stone for a long time, and she had thought about all the hands that had placed things on that stone across 30 years, and she had said aloud to the empty clearing and the ridge above it and whatever was behind the ridge that she was sorry it had ended. She said the ridge had been quiet, but the clearing had not felt empty. I want to tell you about the country in September of 2022, because the country itself is part of what I am trying to convey, and I have not described it adequately. The White Mountains in September are in the final days of the season when the interior shows its full palette before winter eliminates everything except white and gray. The birch are at peak color, a yellow that is not the warm yellow of butter or sunlight, but the clear, sharp yellow of something pushed to its most distilled expression. The tree, having spent 5 months making chlorophyll and now spending the last 2 weeks showing what it had been doing underneath the green the whole time. The alder along the creek drainages has gone orange-brown, the leaves papery and curled, and the high-bush cranberry is red, an almost artificial red, against the dark green of the spruce. The spruce itself does not change. White spruce stays green through the darkest winter, the one constant in a season of transformation, and in September it looks particularly vivid against everything around it that is changing. The ground underfoot in the White Mountains in September is a combination of surfaces that a person from the lower 48 cannot fully prepare for. Tussock grass, the hummocky sedge that grows from permafrost ground in rounded mounds about knee-height, and between them the soft, wet gaps where your foot sinks unexpectedly, is the primary challenge cross-country. You learn to walk on top of the tussocks rather than between them, which requires a kind of balance and attention that becomes, over years of practice, as automatic as walking on flat ground. But it never becomes easy. 40 miles of tussock walking will test anyone's knees regardless of age, and I was 74 and my knees had 40 years of field work behind them. So the 3 miles from the maintained trail to the bench was not the casual walk it had been in my 40s. I took my time. I stopped to rest twice. I was not in a hurry. The bench was going to be there. The creek was going to be there. Whatever was going to happen regardless of the pace I set. The interior in September smells like the end of things that are not entirely ending. The dominant smell is the cold, which is a smell people from warmer climates are surprised to find has its own character, a cleanness that is almost metallic, the absence of the organic complexity of warmer air. Under it, there is the resin of the spruce, strongest in the midday warmth when the temperature briefly climbs to the 50s, and the wet earth of the creek bank and the fungal undertone of decomposing leaves. I have spent thousands of hours in this smell. It is, after 50 years of association, the smell of being in the right place. The smell that means the world is still organized the way it is supposed to be organized. The structure, when I came to it in the late afternoon, was in better condition than I had expected. 28 years of weather and time and the settlement of the permafrost had not destabilized it. The logs of the walls were solid, weathered to a gray that matched the older deadfall in the surrounding spruce, and the clay of the fire ring had cracked in some places, but had been repaired, the fresh clay still showing the fingerprint impressions of whatever had worked it in. That detail, the fingerprints, is the one I keep returning to when I think about that afternoon. Not because of the size of the prints, though they were large, the broad oval impression of a palm significantly wider than my own, because of the pattern. There were 4 distinct fingerprint impressions in the fresh clay section, arranged in the pattern of fingers wrapped around a ball of clay being pressed into place, and the spacing of the 4 impressions was consistent across the repair, as if the same hand had worked from one side of the section to the other in a single pass. Systematic repair. The attention of someone who knew the fire ring needed maintenance and knew how to do it. I thought about Earl Cooper's father's moose bone. I thought about the obsidian blade from Botswana. I thought about Faye's 7 bundles of classified plant material. I stood in the late September light of the White Mountains and looked at those fingerprints in fresh clay and understood that the work the section had done had never been about discovery. It had been about acknowledgement. We had not found a species. We had, over 24 years of deliberate and careful presence, acknowledged one that had always been there. We had participated in the oldest conversation the interior has to offer, the conversation between a living thing and the country it knows, conducted in the language of presence and attention and the accumulated trust of repeated return. We had not spoken that language well. We had spoken it badly by the standards of the people who had been speaking it for centuries before us, the Athabascan communities along the Tanana and the Yukon, who had developed a whole knowledge system around the relationship. We had spoken it badly, but we had spoken it, and the response 28 years later in the form of a silver-shouldered figure standing at the edge of my firelight suggested that badly was sufficient. Badly but sincerely, badly but consistently. Badly but over enough time that the intent became clear even through the clumsiness of the execution. I went back to the Birch Creek drainage in the fall of 2022. I am going to tell you this plainly and let you do with it what you will. I was 74 years old, 2 years out from Eleanor's death, and I drove up the Steese Highway in a rented four-wheel drive truck and walked into the White Mountains on the trail that was now maintained for recreational use, and that passed within 3 miles of the bench above Birch Creek, where the section had made its base camp in the summer of '73. I left the maintained trail and went cross-country on the old route that my body remembered better than my mind thought it would, and I came to the bench in the late afternoon. The camp bench had been reclaimed by vegetation, birch and alder grown up through the open area where we had pitched our tents, the ground soft with decades of leaf fall. The creek below was the same, the ridge above was the same, and the structure was there. Not the same structure. The original logs had long since settled into the ground and been absorbed by the soil and the vegetation, but in the same location, with the same orientation, with the same opening to the south, there was a structure. Newer, the logs still solid though weathered, the interior cleared and prepared with what appeared to be fresh spruce boughs on the sleeping platform. The fire ring had been renewed with fresh clay coursing. The flat stone was still there, or its successor was, a flat stone of similar dimensions in the same position. I placed the smoked salmon I had brought from Fairbanks, wrapped in birch bark the way Connie had always prepared it on the flat stone. I set up my tent on the bench in the same position I had always used. I made my fire. I did not sleep. Around midnight, the vocalizations came from the ridge. I sat by my fire and listened. They went on for the better part of an hour, varying in pattern in ways that I could recognize as structured without being able to parse the structure. Some sequences I had heard before, 40 or 50 years before, and they registered in my memory the way an old song does, not in the words but in the shape. The body remembers things the mind has given up trying to hold. When the vocalization stopped, I waited. The aurora was out, the green moving slow across the northern sky, and the birch on the slope above me were lit silver as they had always been in the aurora. And I was 74 years old and alone in the White Mountains on a September night with the temperature dropping toward 20 degrees, and I was not cold, and I was not afraid, and I was not young, and all of those things were fine. The footsteps came down from the ridge at about 1 in the morning, slower than I remembered, though that might have been my memory of faster nights rather than any actual slowing. They stopped at the edge of the firelight, the same 30 feet, the same position as 1994. I did not look up immediately. I sat as I always sat, and then I looked. The silver at the shoulders had spread. The entire upper back and shoulders and the sides of the face were silver now. The dark near black of the body hair still dense on the trunk and the arms and the legs, but the silver marking that had been a band across the shoulders in '74 was now more than half the visible coat, moving down over the chest and partway along the outer arms. The face, which I had seen only in shadow and firelight in '74, was clearer now because I had positioned my fire differently, with more light thrown upward rather than flat. The brow ridge was heavy, the jaw wide, the nose broad and flat. The eyes were deep set and caught the firelight in the same reddish gold I remembered. The posture was different. Upright still, fully upright, but there was something in the way the weight was distributed slightly forward that was different from the absolute stillness of 1974. The arms did not hang at the full extension they had 28 years before, but was slightly bent at the elbow, the hands forward rather than back. I thought about how a person holds themselves differently at 70 than at 45. The center of gravity shifting forward, the joints accommodating the accumulation of time. I placed the second piece of salmon on the flat stone. I had brought 2 pieces this time, though I had not consciously planned why. I put one on the stone and held the other in my open hand and looked at the fire. The arm extended, The same breadth of hand, the same gentleness. It took the piece from the stone. Then it paused, and I heard the hum, brief and low and directed, not at the ridge, but at me, and it took the second piece from my hand. I felt the warmth of the hand as it closed around the salmon and withdrew, a warmth that was higher than human baseline, the same warmth I had read about in the field reports and in Connie's notes from the Minto elders, the warmth that the traditional knowledge associated with the species and that Elkins had once noted as worth investigating further in a recommendation that had never been acted on. We sat in the firelight together for a while after that, not interacting, being in the same space. When the fire was low enough that the warmth had shifted from comfortable to cool, the figure rose from its crouch and stood for a moment in the posture that I had learned to read as the close of an encounter, not dismissal, completion, the way a conversation ends when both people have said what they came to say. Then it turned, and I watched it walk back into the spruce, unhurried and certain in its movement, and the dark between the trees received it, and it was gone. The aurora was still out overhead. The creek was still running. The September cold was doing what September cold in the White Mountains does, which is to remind you that the interior will do as it pleases with or without your consent or your presence or your understanding. I sat beside the dying coals for the rest of that night. I did not rebuild the fire. I did not go into my tent. I sat on the ground on the bench above the creek in the dark and the aurora, and I took an inventory, the way Elkins used to take inventories of evidence, patient and precise. 28 years since my last encounter in this place. 28 years in which this individual had continued to exist and move and use this drainage and its surrounding country, while the institutions that had acknowledged its existence for a brief institutional moment had buried that acknowledgement under classification tiers that no active officer now living could access, while the people who had built that acknowledgement had retired and died and taken their personal records with them, while the world continued to take photographs of blurry shapes in the distance and argue about whether what it was looking at was real. It is real. I want to be precise about this, and I am going to be precise in a way that is going to require you to sit with certain implications. The existence of this species is not a matter of contested evidence or competing interpretations of ambiguous data. It is a matter of classified military records generated by a unit that operated for 24 years, collected over 1,200 photographs and 200 hours of audio and 300 items of physical evidence, and concluded with documented encounters with the living species under controlled observation conditions. The evidence has not been destroyed. It is buried under classification structures that were designed not to deny the truth, but to protect what the truth made vulnerable. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference matters. The species has a relationship with the Athabascan people of the interior that extends back beyond any written record. Thomas in Minto, speaking to me in 1973, was conveying knowledge that had been accumulated over a span of time that makes the Army's 24-year program look like a weekend project. The traditional knowledge was right. Everything the section's scientific and intelligence apparatus eventually confirmed, the behavioral patterns, the communication structures, the tool use, the management of the territory, the long lifespan, all of it was present in the oral record before any military analyst ever looked at a footprint in the snow. The section's work did not discover the species. The section's work confirmed what the people who had lived alongside the species for centuries had been saying clearly and without embellishment to anyone willing to listen, which for a very long time was nobody with a uniform or a laboratory. I want to tell you about the country, not as atmospheric description, not as context for what I witnessed, but because the country is not separate from the story. The interior of Alaska, the 200 and some thousand square miles of drainage and mountain and tundra and boreal forest that stretches from the Alaska Range in the south to the Brooks Range in the north, and from the Canadian border in the east to the Yukon River country in the west, is one of the last genuinely intact wilderness systems in the northern hemisphere. It is intact not because humans have protected it, though some of it has been formally protected in recent decades, but because it has been too large and too cold and too remote for the kind of systematic exploitation that has altered most of the world's wild places. The species we documented lives there because it has always lived there, and because the country has maintained itself at a scale that can accommodate a population of large, intelligent, territory-using hominids alongside every other claim the land makes on itself. The permafrost under the Tanana Flats holds the memory of 10,000 years of freeze and thaw cycles in its ice wedges and polygonal patterns. The white spruce on the Upper Salcha grew from seed in the same season that certain European institutions the world still considers old were founded. The caribou herds that move through the 40-mile country in the fall are following routes established long enough ago that the routes themselves have shaped the territory. And in this country, in the drainages and the ridge systems and the creek valleys that no road reaches, a species that predates every map and every nation and every institution claiming authority over any of it continues to exist because the country is large enough and cold enough and old enough to hold them. This is what I believe the section was actually protecting, though it took me decades to frame it this way. Not a secret, not a classified asset, not even precisely a species, though all of those framings were present in the official documentation. What the section was protecting was a relationship. The oldest kind of relationship the interior supports between a species and its territory built over a span of time that makes 24 years look like a moment. The moment the section existed in was a fraction of the story, but the fraction mattered. The fraction was 24 years of the Army saying, whether it used those words or not, that what lives in these mountains deserves to continue living here, that the encounter we are in the process of having should be handled with care, that the default should be protection rather than extraction. That default has not always held in the history of military engagement with the natural world. It does not always hold now, but it held for 24 years in the interior of Alaska, and the evidence of that holding is buried in a classified archive in Fort Meade, Maryland. And the consequence of that holding is that in the Birch Creek drainage, in the White Mountains north of Fairbanks, in a structure in a stand of white spruce above a creek that runs cold and clear over a gravel bed, there is, as of September of 2022, a living being who has been alive long enough to have known 6 different people who came to the same place to leave salmon on a flat stone. I am the last of the 6. The question I am most often asked in the conversations I have begun to have in the final years of my life is whether I am afraid of what I know, afraid of the implications, afraid of what happens when the world finds out. I spent a lot of years being afraid of what I know. I spent a lot of years managing the fear, by managing the information, keeping it contained, keeping it classified, keeping the pressure of it inside the institutional architecture that had been built specifically to hold it. And then Eleanor died, and Elkins died, and Dade was gone, and Cooper was gone, and Sproul was gone, and the institutional architecture became the only thing I had. And I understood that an archive is not a relationship, and a classification is not a protection, and that what I had been part of had mattered too much to leave inside a filing system. The closure of the section in 1995 produced in me a feeling I have not been able to fully name in the 30 years since. Not grief exactly, though there was that. Not relief, though there was some of that too. The particular lightening that comes when a responsibility that has organized your life is finally lifted. It was more like the feeling I imagine a translator has when the language they have spent their life learning to speak is no longer spoken anywhere. The competency remains, the context disappears. I had become, over 19 years, fluent in something that had no application outside of the specific place and the specific relation that had produced the fluency. That competency is still in me. The ability to read a field, to hear a sound from a ridgeline and parse it into the categories that Elkins's spectrographic work had given us. The ability to sit still by a fire for hours in a way that communicates presence without threat. The ability to place a piece of salmon on a flat stone and walk away. These are not skills that the Army found useful after the section closed. They are not skills that have application in the world I have lived in since. They are the particular competencies of a specific relation, and they wait in me the way all trained capacities wait, ready, patient, hoping for the circumstance that calls them out. I am not afraid, not of the implications and not of what happens when the world finds out, because what happens when the world finds out is not up to me. What the world does with truth is never up to the person who held the truth. What is up to me is the telling, and the telling requires only that I be as precise as I can manage about what I observed and what I believed and what I did. So here is what I observed. A species exists in the interior of Alaska and almost certainly across a much wider range of the subarctic and boreal forest zone of North America that is bipedal, fully upright, and significantly larger than any documented human population. It uses stone and bone tools worked to a level of craft that places it in a tradition of technical knowledge extending back generations. It maintains fire, not by starting it, but by preserving and transporting it, a capability that in the archaeological record is considered one of the markers of advanced cognitive function in any hominid lineage. It has a complex vocal communication system with structural properties consistent with language, including syntax, reference, and the capacity for tonal modification of meaning. It manages its territory through selective harvesting and habitat modification in ways that increase ecological complexity in its territory. It has a social structure with differentiated roles and almost certainly systems for transmitting knowledge across generations. It is capable of making and sustaining deliberate decisions about its relationship with human communities, decisions that show awareness of long time spans and that have been consistent across multiple human generations, and it is extremely long-lived by human reckoning, with individuals persisting in the record across spans of time that suggest a biological clock running on fundamentally different parameters from our own. Here is what I believed. I believed and believe that the section's decision to maintain secrecy was correct for the specific historical moment it occupied, and that the time for that correctness has passed. I believe that the traditional knowledge of the Athabascan people was and is the most accurate and the most ethically grounded account of this species' existence and of the appropriate human relationship to it, and that any future engagement with the subject, whether by governments or scientific institutions or the general public, should begin with that knowledge rather than with the frameworks that Western science will inevitably want to impose. I believe that the species has survived this long because it has been effectively invisible to the institutions that would harm it, and that visibility, if it comes, should come on terms that include the species' interest as a consideration rather than purely as an object of study. And here's what I did. I spent 19 years in the field documenting what I could document, participating in an exchange protocol that over decades grew into a relationship that I do not have a precise word for, but that I know was real. I sat beside a fire on a September night in 1994 and shared that night with a being who had made the decision to be present rather than absent, who had chosen to close the distance rather than maintain it, who had taken food from my hand with a gentleness that I will carry as a memory for whatever years are left to me. I sat beside a fire on another September night in 2022 and did it again. And in both cases, what I brought to the fire was everything I had to offer, which was attention, presence, and the accumulated understanding of a life spent trying to learn how to be in a place without imposing myself on it. The thing that people who were not in the field do not understand about what the section produced is that the most significant data it generated was not in the photographs or the audio recordings or the physical evidence logs. The most significant data was in the field journals, the daily records of what it felt like to be a human being in a continuous relationship with a species that was, by any measure available to us, at least as intelligent as we were, and in many respects more so. The records of what that relationship asked of the people in it, the records of how it changed the people in it, not all at once, but incrementally, the way any long relationship changes a person, by revealing the limits of what they thought they understood, and by expanding those limits through the accumulation of evidence that the limits were wrong. Elkins said to me, in one of our last phone calls before his death, that the section's work had given him a different relationship to his own species. 20 years of continuous, careful observation of a being of comparable intelligence and greater wisdom about the land it inhabited had permanently altered his framework for thinking about what Homo sapiens was and what it was for. He said he no longer understood us as the apex of anything, not cognitively, not ecologically, not in terms of our relationship to the world we inhabited. He said he understood us as one expression of a family of beings that had diverged long enough ago that we had forgotten the family and that the forgetting was the source of a great deal of what was worst about us. The section's work had been, for him, a partial corrective to that forgetting, a reminder that the divergence was not as total as we had believed, that there was still kin out there in the mountains, in the drainages, in the stands of old spruce where the morning light came through at angles that had not changed in 1,000 years. I agree with Elkins. I have agreed with him on very few things as dramatically as I agree with him on this. We are not what we think we are. We are not the only version of what we could be. In the interior of Alaska, in the country north of Fairbanks, where the birch turns gold in September and the aurora comes out over the ridge and the creek runs cold through the dark, there is a version of what we could have been that is still there, still moving through the country it has always known, still maintaining its territory, with the patience and the intelligence and the deep competence of a species that has not decided the world exists primarily for its benefit. I left the section's operational area for the last time in the fall of 2022. I walked out of the White Mountains on the maintained recreational trail that goes north from the Steese Highway, and I came out at the trailhead where I had parked the rented truck, and I drove back toward Fairbanks on a highway that runs through spruce forest and birch and past the turnoffs to the villages along the Tanana. The mountains were behind me, the Alaska Range ahead, in the south, Denali visible above the smaller ranges in the distance, the white peak catching the last afternoon light. I drove and I thought about 24 years of a unit that no one outside of a very small number of people has ever heard of. And I thought about Thomas and Minto and what he said about bridges, and I thought about Connie and her salmon and her patient, precise translations of a knowledge that her community had held for centuries without anyone from the outside world being willing to receive it. I thought about Roy Elkins on his hands and knees in the snow measuring toe splay angles with the concentration of a man who understood that precision was itself a form of respect. I thought about Lester Dade standing on the game trail in 73, looking at a being 60 feet away and making the assessment, quietly and correctly, that what the eyes across from him contained was not threat, but consideration. I thought about Earl Cooper talking about his father's moose bone and what it meant to give something like that to someone else. I thought about Faye standing at the edge of the Birch Creek clearing in 2015 and apologizing to the Ridge for the ending of things. I thought about Eleanor, who had listened on 4 winter evenings to the story of a 24-year operation and responded with the question that was the right question. What do you believe? I believe the country is old enough to contain things we have not named. I believe that unnamed does not mean unknown, and that known does not mean understood, and that understood does not mean ours. I believe that the most honest thing I can say about 19 years of fieldwork with the section is that the work taught me the particular humility of continuous attention to something that does not need your understanding to exist. The creek does not run for you. The aurora does not perform. And the being that sat across a fire from me in September of 74 and again in September of 2022 did not come to the fire because it needed me to witness it. It came for its own reasons, which included whatever calculation it had made about the humans who kept returning to its territory with salmon and respect and the willingness to sit still. I have sat still. For 19 years in the field and for 30 more since, I have sat still with what I know. And now I am telling it because Thomas was right that there are questions about what you are willing to become. And the answer I have arrived at, late, is that I am willing to become the person who told the truth when he had the years and the clarity and the freedom to do so, without the telling causing the harm that it might have caused in an earlier time. The files are at Fort Meade. The recordings exist, the photographs exist, the field journals exist, or most of them do, in the controlled access repository where Sproul said they would be, under the classification that he said would make them findable only by someone who already knew to look. Someone someday will know to look. The institutional memory of the section is not entirely gone. The Army is a large organization, and it has a long memory for some things. And for those within its structure who know what designation to search under, the 24-year operational history of the Environmental Biological Survey Section at Fort Wainwright, Alaska, is a retrievable set of documents. What is not retrievable from any document is what the work felt like, what it cost and what it gave, what it produced in the people who did it, the slow and permanent alteration of a fundamental assumption about the world and our place in it. I am the last of the section's original personnel. I am 76 years old, and I am in good health, and I intend to remain so for as long as the country will allow. I still live in Fairbanks. On clear nights in September, when the aurora comes out and the temperature drops below freezing, and the birch outside my window has turned the color that birch turns when the light changes from summer to autumn, I sit on the back porch of my house and face north toward the White Mountains, which are visible on clear days as a line of dark ridges against the sky about 40 miles out. I cannot see the Birch Creek drainage from here, but I know the direction. The body remembers the direction even when the distance is too great for the eyes. On one of those September evenings last year, I heard a sound that I had not heard from my back porch in the 30 years I had lived in this house. Low, brief, directional, carried by a north wind that was cold off the ridge country and moving south across the Tanana Flats toward Fairbanks. A single sequence of tones structured in the pattern I had spent 2 decades learning to recognize and then gone before I could be certain I had heard it and not remembered it into the present. I sat very still for a long time after. The country is old enough to carry sound a long way, and the country has been carrying its own knowledge for longer than any classification system has existed to suppress it. This is what the Army knew. This is what the Army buried. And this is what I am telling you now, because I sat across a fire from it and I held his gift in my hand and I owe it the respect of accuracy. They are there. They have always been there, and the mountains above the Birch Creek drainage in the White Mountains north of Fairbanks have been watching us work out what we are willing to accept about the world, with the patience of something that has been watching far longer than we have been here to be watched. I drove out of those mountains on a September morning in 2022, and I did not look back. The rearview mirror showed spruce and birch and a blue interior sky, and the ridge above the creek receding as the truck moved toward the highway. I did not look back because looking back is not the point. The point is what you carry forward. And what I carry forward after 76 years and 19 years in the field and one September night in 1994 and another in 2022 is the specific burden of having been trusted with a truth that the world has not yet decided it is ready to receive. I am ready to give it. I have given it, and if the mountains of the interior and the old white spruce on the ridge above Birch Creek and the being who has been watching that drainage since before the Army existed have any opinion about the telling, I believe it is this. It was past time. The aurora is out tonight. The ridge is dark. The creek, I am certain, is still running.